Hello and welcome to the second installment of our new webinar series, British Houses and Heritage with Curt DiCamillo. My name is Ginevra Morse. I am the Director of Education and Online Programs at American Ancestors and New England Historic Genealogical Society. I will be your moderator and virtual MC for today's event. American Ancestors is a nonprofit organization supported by our members and donors. We are the oldest and largest genealogical organization in the country, and we specialize in providing resources, research, and expertise to uncover and share the stories of families, family objects, and family homes. We are pleased to offer such programming for our members and friends around the world. Today, we'll explore the history of Highclere Castle, the main filming location for Downton Abbey. You'll hear stories of its architecture, beautiful interiors, and its inhabitants. We'll also introduce you to many of the real-life characters that inspired the beloved television series. If you have any questions, please feel free to type them into the question panel to the right of your screen. You can do so at any point during the presentation. We will answer as many as we can at the end. And I also want to note that we are, of course, broadcasting from our homes with various limitations and distractions. We do apologize in advance if there are any interruptions from our end, and we thank you for your patience. Even if we do lose connection, you will have access to a full recording of the session on our website. And our expert guide for this series is Curt DiCamillo, an internationally recognized authority on English country houses and the decorative arts. Curt joined American Ancestors in February 2016 as our first curator of special collections. Curt has led highly successful heritage tours for our organization to England, Scotland, and Italy. He has lectured extensively in the United States and abroad, and has also taught classes on British culture and art at the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. Curt was previously Executive Director of the National Trust for Scotland Foundation USA. As Curator of Special Collections at NEHGS, Curt provides direction and expert guidance for organizing and exhibiting our extensive collection of family history-related artifacts. So please join me in welcoming Curt DiCamillo.
Hello, everybody. I'm sitting here in my apartment in Boston where it's 82 degrees, and I'm thinking back to the first one of these British Heritage lectures I gave for NEHGS in early May when it was going to snow that night. And I just want to say, in a month's time, we've gone from snow to hot, and this is welcome to New England. So welcome to you all for joining us on what is a very beautiful day here in Boston. So I'm assuming that everybody here knows that the real reason we're talking about this house is because what you see in front of you here, which is the poster for Downton Abbey. This was the most popular program ever in the history of PBS. It brought in numbers, ratings numbers that were in the league with commercial broadcasts on cable or one of the major networks, something that had never before happened. And of course, because of that, it spawned all kinds of interest in not just British history and decorative arts, but family history. And speaking of families, I think we need to see the real family behind this house, Highclere Castle. You're looking at the arms of the Earls of Carnarvon, who have been here since 1670, which I think to American ears sounds very old. It actually isn't. They're considered sort of newcomers. But it's important to talk about the house that they lived in for most of its existence, which was not called Highclere Castle, it was called Highclere House. And you'll see in the next slide an image of it as it looked in the 18th century. And I should also say that on this site, there has been a house for over 1,300 years, which is pretty amazing. What you see on the right, Highclere Castle, sort of engulfed Highclere House. That house is still there. This has been built around it, and it was all because of changing styles and changing fashions. The owner in the 19th century, when this was done, of Highclere, wanted a more stylish house. And as you'll see in the next slide, his name was the third Earl of Carnarvon. He wanted something that was more in keeping with his elevated status, so he hired this man, Sir Charles Barry, who you see on the right, to rebuild and encase his house. And it's important to remember why Charles Barry is famous to us today, and most particularly why everybody who is anybody wanted him to design something for them. And that's because of the most famous thing he ever did, one of the most famous buildings in the world, the Houses of Parliament, which was built between 1840 and 1876, made him an international star. So in this next slide, you can see these two buildings put side by side, and you can definitely see the influence of the Houses of Parliament on Highclere Castle. The style is very much the same, but the story goes back even further than that. Charles Barry, about 20 years before, worked for Baron Sudeley, the first Baron, we'll just call him Lord Sudeley, and he built for him a house in Gloucestershire called Toddington Manor. And this house, which is started about 1819, is considered to be the prototype for the Houses of Parliament. And that's not just supposition, because Lord Sudeley was the chairman of the commission to pick an architect for the new Houses of Parliament. In 1830, the old Houses of Parliament had burned down, and they needed a competition to pick a new style. Not surprisingly, I suspect Lord Sudeley picked a style for the Houses of Parliament based on his house. And that's what you see here. These two together, you can clearly see the connection of this. Now, what Lord Sudeley did was he spent so much money on building this new house that he ended up virtually bankrupting his family. So the house suffered a lot in the succeeding years. By the early 20th century, the family had to sell the house, and it was left sort of derelict. It became a school, became a used car showroom. And you see a photograph I took here probably about 15 years ago when a friend and I snuck into the grounds, closed to the public, the house was boarded up, still an active agricultural estate, which of course is the very nature of what a country house is, I should say that. A country house is or was a house that had at its center an agricultural estate that supported the house. That's how the income was made. There were no investments. There was no stock market in existence. So everything was land. As Scarlett O'Hara's father said in Gone with the Wind, the only thing that matters is land. And you farmed the land or you leased the land to farmers who farmed it for you, and all that money flowed in to build these great houses. So this house fell in hard times. It was still farmed, and when my friend and I went in, we were going around taking photographs like the one you see here, and there were sheep and cows milling around us. And at one point, my friend, she turned to me and she said, "Look behind you." And all the cows, probably like 20 or 25 of them, had lined up single file and were following us wherever we went around the house, which was really eerie and very much sort of like something out of Alfred Hitchcock. But I'm still here to tell the tale, so they didn't kill me, at least not yet. So the inside of this house is every bit as grand as the outside. And you'll see in this next slide, taken by a colleague, while it was still unoccupied, the library, which was, we believe, the model for the library of the House of Commons and the Houses of Parliament. Incredibly rich. Every one of these rooms is incredibly rich. When we get to the next room, when we get to the drawing room, you can see that it has plasterwork on the ceiling that is covered with solid gold leaf that gives it a sense of grandeur that I think is hard for us to digest today. This is a house that has over 200 rooms. It was also one of the first domestic interiors to have an ecclesiastical feel to it. And you can see that in this next slide, which is a hallway with stained glass windows, which probably doesn't seem that unusual to us, but stained glass up until this time had been primarily the reserve of churches. And this is the beginning of a new trend that spread around the world to actually have stained glass in a domestic interior. So by 2005, this house was in really bad shape. It was on the official list of English heritage of buildings at risk. And it was bought by a famous artist in 2005 who paid about £5 million for the house. And his name, of course, was Damien Hirst. And you see him here in 1994 with one of his famous pieces of art called Away from the Flock, which is a sheep in formaldehyde, an actual sheep. He made a fortune from this kind of art, and he used it to buy this incredible house, which he was going to turn into his home and also a museum of modern art. Now, that was in 2005, and you'll see in the next slide here, Um, 15 years later, the house is still covered in scaffolding. This is the largest scaffolding project in Europe. And you can see a photograph above that I took when we snuck in. That's the same view of the house you're looking at now. And this has been a cause of concern for a lot of people in the neighborhood, basically like anybody doing a renovation. When are you actually going to do this? He's coming under more and more pressure. He said he's been very busy with other projects. He can't get to it right now. Let's just hope he gets to it soon. So let's get to the focus of the real focus of this lecture, which of course is Highclere Castle. And what you see is the entrance hall, which is filmed an awful lot in the TV series for Downton Abbey. And this is Charles Barry at his best. This is very much, those of you who have visited the Houses of Parliament, this is very much the same feeling you get in the hallways when you're walking in there, just like you do at the house. And you come into the house, and of course you see what is arguably the most famous room, which is the gallery, sort of a great hall that has a skylight at the top that Barry installed that apparently has never stopped leaking since it was put in. And the rooms I'm going to show you here are all rooms that were used in the filming that are the most famous rooms, the rooms you can see when you go to visit the house, because of course it's open to the public. The most important piece of art in the house, I would argue, is this Van Dyke of Charles I mounted that hangs in the dining room. And this was used a lot in the film. You would see the family having breakfast here, you'd see them having dinner. And there's this great sense of grandeur that a portrait like this gives you. But the room itself, of course, is nothing to sneeze at. To me, the most wonderful room is the library. Once again, Charles Barry at his absolute best. He later designed a club in London called the Reform Club, and that library there is considered to have been probably modeled on the library here at Highclere Castle. I always tell Americans that who see these houses and say, oh my God, wouldn't it be wonderful to live in one of these things? Like, it's a ball and chain to inherit one of these because it's a nonstop money pit. And as you'll see in the next slide, there are over 50 rooms at Highclere that are so damaged they aren't open. They mainly have mold and leaks. They just shut the door and don't go in there anymore. This is not a choice. This is a choice based on money, which is to say there isn't enough of it. So out of 300 rooms, 50 of them are blocked off. And you'll see in the next slide, the current Earl, the owner, the 8th Earl, in one of these rooms, they estimate that it's $15 million to do essential repairs to bring the house up to standard. When I say $15 million for essential repairs, I'm not talking about doing pretty things like wallpaper and carpet. I'm talking about plumbing and electricity and structural work. And this is what I mean about a ball and chain. This is a huge responsibility to inherit one of these houses. And if you remember back to Downton Abbey and to Lord Grantham, he's always saying, I don't want to be the Earl who lost it all. And I would suspect that's the same way that Lord Carnarfon feels, because he could sell this house, especially today after Downton Abbey, for a fortune and get a nice bank account and live in a smaller house somewhere. But his family has been here since 1670, and he does not want to be the one who walks away. But speaking of walking, here's his wife, the Countess, vacuuming last month. No, actually, I should say April, so almost 2 months ago. This was a new experience because the staff has all been furloughed because of COVID-19. And this was in the papers in Britain, discovering where the vacuum cleaners are kept, vacuuming the floors. In the interview, she said that she can't do everything. She's only one person after all. And she's not doing dusting, she's doing minimal vacuuming because this is still an agricultural estate. There's 5,000 acres attached to the house. There are a lot of farm animals that have to be taken care of, and they're living things. So the Countess has decided that's the more important thing to focus on. You do the minimal cleaning, and then you take care of the animals. So once again, not the glamorous life that I think a lot of people suspect. So beautiful grounds. What you see here is probably the most famous shot of Highclere Castle. Capability Brown, who you see in the upper left there, is considered possibly the greatest landscape designer in history, certainly in English history. He lived in the 18th century, and he landscaped the design of what we see today. That arrow you see is pointing to 2 cedars of Lebanon that he had brought back as seeds from Lebanon and planted here, and they're still here over 250 years later today. He also did something that's quite common in these great houses, is that there was a village, a local village in the way of the vista of the house, and they just destroyed it and moved it somewhere else so that the family didn't have to look out and see small houses out of their window. I think it's also important to say that country houses have been a sense of innovation for a long time, something that's not generally spoken of, and that's innovation in all kinds of ways. And in this next slide, you'll see it's actually innovation in an agricultural way. There is a breed of holly called Highclere holly that was developed here in the 1830s. It's a hybrid, and what makes it important for handling is it doesn't have the prickly leaves that we associate with holly, which is why it's very popular for Christmas displays. It's something that is still grown on the estate, and it's something that I think is a wonderful little snippet of history. So, making money. These houses have to make money, and agriculture only provides a little bit of that. So you're looking here at the London Lodge that was built in the 18th century. This is one of the formal entrances to the house. It was built as a house, actually, for a lodge keeper and probably his wife. And there are 2 rooms, as you can see, on either side of the gate. And the purpose of the lodge keeper was to actually go out and open the gate and let people in and out. The lodge had been abandoned for about 50 years, and in 2019, Lady Carnarfon converted it into a holiday rental. You see here, you get 2 rooms, and you have to walk between them outside, but it's wicked cool. This is actually the sitting room and the bedroom you see here, and this is a perfect way that houses like this can make money on the side, not just depending on agriculture or other things that involve the land. This house, like most great houses, is dotted with follies. And a folly is something that was put in the landscape as an eye catcher or to have a little party in. And in this case, I'm talking about the Temple of Diana, which you see here, which you can see from the London Lodge, that was built in the 18th century as a place to come for refreshment. So it's actually 2 floors, 2 primary floors. The first floor where the big windows are is where the lords and ladies would eat usually a lunch or a tea, and then beneath them in the basement level were kitchens where the food would be brought up. And this isn't used, as you would imagine, today at all, except as an eye catcher, but it's important to give you the sense of the vista of what it's like to walk around an English estate. To me, this is a huge thing. When I go to visit these houses, I want to be able to feel like I do actually, like I'm walking into a different time period, even if it's 2020. It's a different feel, and there's nothing in this world to me that can replace walking in a great English estate, and this is a perfect example of that. So the most important person in our story is this man, the 5th Earl of Carnarvon, who became Earl in the late 19th century and lived until the 1920s. He, like a lot of men of his class and time, spent a lot of money. Some of it he didn't have, and he needed money, and he needed to marry somebody with money. And the woman he married, you'll see in the next slide, is somebody who had a lot of money. Her maiden name was Almina Wombwell. You see her here after she married him as the Countess of Carnarfon. There's a great story here because she had 2 strikes against her in British society. She was illegitimate and she was Jewish. But money trumps everything. And her father, you'll see in the next slide, Alfred de Rothschild, was one of the richest men in Britain. He never married. This was his only known child, and he acknowledged her as his child, not in a public sense, but within society, by which I mean upper society. It was well known that anyone who married her would get a very nice settlement from him. He was the first Jew to ever be a director of the Bank of England. He was accepted by the establishment, Rothschilds usually were, and he settled upon his future son-in-law almost $100 million in today's values, which helped pay down a lot of the debts that he had. But it's also important to talk about the house that she grew up in and that Alfred de Rothschild built, which is not very far. There are a whole cluster of Rothschild houses in Buckinghamshire and Hertfordshire, 2 counties that are adjacent to each other in southern England. So this is Halton House that he built for himself in the mid-19th century, an incredibly rich French chateau-style house. He loved entertaining. he had a private orchestra that he would conduct with a baton that was encrusted with diamonds. He had his own private 3-ring circus that he had on the lawn, a semi-permanent building that he would use just to entertain his guests. What's missing today, which you'll see in the next slide, is the winter garden that he built, which was this wonderful vista of a garden year-round, which Britain was much colder then than it is today. So having warm plants, exotic plants, was a very big thing. So you see it there on the left where that red arrow is. It had one big glass dome and then 9 smaller glass domes went all the way around it. And as you'll see in the next slide, it was wonderfully lush on the inside. And he would host parties here where he would have only men for the weekend, and there would be women who'd be brought in to, shall we say, entertain the men and hang around the gardens and hide in the bushes and jump out and have frolicking fun, and probably a little more than just fun. It was a party house, and everyone who came loved the generosity of the Rothschilds. The great hall of this house, which is very indicative of the Rothschild taste, which you'll see in the next slide, says everything you need to know about the Rothschilds, which is that they love things over the top, big bling. Everything you see in here is important in a collecting sense. The most important decorative arts, most important paintings, the most expensive, everything was gilded to within an inch of its life. And it wasn't just him. There were at one point over 40 major Rothschild houses throughout Europe, and all of them shared a similarity. So much so that we have a saying today that means the taste of the Rothschilds, le goût Rothschild, this over-the-top, big, blingy taste. Alfred never recovered from the tragedy of the First World, and it ended up, after he died, just after the First World War ended, that the house came into the ownership of the Royal Air Force, who still own it today. And the whole thing is now a base, but the house is an officers' club. And they need to make money like everybody else. And you can see that great hall today, and how they make money, the officers' club, is that it's used for filming, for interiors of Buckingham Palace, for any kind of grand house. I can't tell you the number of times that I've seen this in a PBS TV series or in a movie. And why it's relevant to the story here is because if you think back to when Lady Mary was engaged to Sir Richard, that upstart newspaperman, he bought a house for her called Hexby Park, and they walked through it together. It was empty, and she was putting him down as to why families like hers don't buy furniture, they just have it. Well, what they were walking through was Halton House. That served as the interior of this imaginary house. And as oftentimes happens, this house had an exterior shot that was a different house in the interior. Movie companies, directors, film producers oftentimes like the look of one house from the outside and another one from the inside. So for the exterior of Hexby Park, they used Waddesdon Manor, also in Buckinghamshire, which is today owned by the National Trust. This is the only great Rothschild house in the world left that has all of its original contents in it. Incredibly rich and over the top, built by Ferdinand de Rothschild, a cousin of Alfred, and even more so than Halton, interiors that sort of boggle the mind. You'll see in the next slide here, the red drawing room, which is not just big and blingy and very French, and I should say that the Rothschilds, even though they were from German extraction, loved French, everything French. So you see French decorative arts, and then you see great English paintings. When I say great, I don't mean just any old portraits. Almost everything in here is a Gainsborough or Reynolds. And you can see the same thing in the dining room. The dining room is, you felt like you walk into the court of Louis XVI. It's so over the top. This photograph, which I took at night without any kind of light, except for the light you see there, just came out magically, and that's what it's like to walk through there. And like his cousin, Baron Ferdinand loved to entertain as well. And this is one of the similarities that you'll see that comes up again and again between the fictional Downton Abbey and the real world that we live in, because you have these two Rothschild houses that were used for filming of a fictional house, but how they come together and the similarities that keep circling back again and again are very intriguing, because the Rothschilds entertained everybody. And even though they were Jewish, which was usually a death knell in British society, even Queen Victoria came to Waddesdon Manor. Everybody who was anybody, particularly her son, the Prince of Wales, loved rich men, and he spent a lot of time here. So you have this wonderful sense of Rothschild coming together with Downton Abbey, and then you have our famous couple here who get married on June 26th of 1895. And where they get married is important. This is the interior of St. Margaret's, Westminster, which is on the grounds of Westminster Abbey. This was and is the society church to get married in. This is where Pepys got married, this is where Winston Churchill got married, and this is where this couple got married. And it's still true today. This is a place that's so popular that you have to book years in advance if you want to have a wedding here. So after the wedding, you have Almina now recast as the Countess of Carnarfon, part of the British aristocracy, no longer illegitimate. She converted to Church of England, and she appears on Then as Now, the magazine for the aristocratic hunty set, which is Country Life magazine. And here she is on the cover of November 8th, 1902 issue. Now, she's very much a creative person. She comes from a background that was not considered the best. And she, I think, gyrated toward other women who also came from backgrounds that maybe not led them to the most perfect fit in British society. And one of her best friends actually lived here, as you'll see in the next slide, possibly the grandest house in England, Blenheim Palace, which was built for the first Duke of Marlborough. And her friend here was Consuelo Vanderbilt, who of course was an American and who was forced into a marriage that she didn't want and that her husband didn't want, but he wanted her money and her mother wanted a title for her daughter. So poof, you have to understand, of course, where Consuelo is coming from. And that, of course, is unbelievable wealth by today's standards. She had a summer house here with her parents, a marble house in Newport. She was the toast of society. She was beautiful. And you'll see in the next slide, her on the cover of a 1989 book called To Marry an English Lord. And this book talks about all the rich the rich American women who were basically pushed into marriages with impoverished but titled British aristocrats in the late 19th and early 20th century. And Consuelo was certainly one of those. Her father, of course, was head of the New York Central Railroad, and he gave his future son-in-law the equivalent of $200 million in New York Central stock as a dowry for his daughter. So you see where I have this red arrow here, an inspiration for the popular television series Downton Abbey. Well, you can see how beautiful Consuelo was. And this book is something that we know Gillian Fellows, who created Downton Abbey, said he used as an inspiration. But more research leads you to believe that the actual real couple that he probably modeled Lord and Lady Grantham after are these two, Lord and Lady Curzon. So same thing, Lord Curzon's got a title, not much money. The wife's family has a lot of money. She didn't want to marry him, he didn't want to marry her. They got married, and just like in Downton Abbey, they learned to love each other. As a matter of fact, they became passionately devoted to each other. Unlike the Duchess of Marlborough, who says she hated her husband when she met him and she never stopped hating him, and he felt the same. They, of course, got divorced. So he became Viceroy of India, which means, of course, that his wife became Vicereine, and she still holds the title today of the highest ranking American ever to serve in the British Empire, because Vicereine of India put her just below the royal family in title holds. But she came from a Chicago family that was self-made. Her mother, I remember her mother by always thinking of the letters CVS. Contemporaries called her crude, vulgar, and socially ambitious. And she pushed her daughter into this marriage. The money came from a famous Chicago department store, which sadly doesn't exist anymore, Marshall Field's. Her father was a property developer, and he put up a lot of the money to found Marshall Field's, which of course now is today Macy's. And it's important to remember, at this point, Chicago was the most dynamic city in America. This is where you made big money in America. And this all came together into this perfect marriage, actually. She died, I think they were only married about 10 years before she died. He never, ever stopped mourning her, even though, of course, he got remarried to another rich American. But this is, I think, the quintessential story that we see going out through Downton Abbey. So back to our dude here, the man who's sort of the focus of this, the fifth Earl. He had been sickly his entire life, and as a young man, he'd been sent to Egypt, then a British protectorate, to recover. He probably had TB or some kind of lung problems. He needed dry weather. And while he was there, he fell in love with antiquities, specifically Egyptian antiquities. After he got married, he used a considerable portion of his wife's money to do excavations, and he hired between 75 and 275 men every day for over 20 years to dig. And he was the first English lord to hire a professional, in this case, Howard Carter, you see here to his right. He was considered among the very first professional archaeologists. And this is important because digging in Egypt, and digging anywhere actually in the ancient world, was a pastime in the 18th and 19th centuries for titled British aristocrats, but most of them weren't really interested in it. They did it because it was stylish. Lord Carnarvon was seriously interested in it. He and Howard Carter set the standards that we use today for professional archaeology. I mean, they took it really seriously. The irony is, after almost 20 years of digging and a lot of money and not much to show for it, Lord Carnarvon said to Howard Carter, this is the last year, we can't do it. And just like a used car salesman, Howard Carter says, I think we're really close. I can feel it. And he convinced Lord Carnarvon, against his better wishes, his better sense, to fund one more year. And that was the year, the most spectacular find in history, in an archaeological sense, which of course was the discovery of Tut's tomb in November of 1922. It's astonishing when you think about this. This is a boy king who was not an important pharaoh, didn't live very long. This, to us, is overwhelming in its grandeur. We know from evidence from other tombs, all of them having been looted, of course, that this was minor compared to what those tombs had. So it's hard to picture how grand these other tombs would have been. But to me, the bigger goosebump moment would have been to be there in 1922 when this was discovered. And you see on the left, after they uncovered the steps leading down to his tomb, and you see the antechamber of the tomb as it was found. So look at that photograph on the right. 3,200 years that has been unseen by human eyes. It's left exactly as it was, or as it fell apart over years. That is, to me, a true goosebump moment. Now, you go from the antechamber into the doorway to the burial chamber, which is where all the gold and most of the treasures we think of today being associated with Tut were discovered. And you can tell this tomb hasn't been disturbed. And it's important to say that almost every tomb was robbed in antiquity by grave robbers. You can tell it hasn't been robbed because of where that red arrow is. That's a sort of a plaster that covered up the doorway. It had to be chipped away to get to the grill that got you into the tomb. So we know this had never been touched before. The thing is that this is as far as Lord Carnarvon got. He never saw the actual gold treasure because he died just after they got into the doorway here. And it's from his death that we have the beginning of the curse of the mummy. Even though other people associated with this expedition died, it's really Lord Carnarvon who set it off. And it comes about from a very explainable issue, which is, it's important to remember, this is the 1920s. There were no antibiotics. Lord Carnarvon probably had a weakened immune system. We know he was shaving with a straight razor in Egypt, and he cut open a mosquito bite that got infected and then turned septic, and then he died. So, you know, that's unfortunate, but not really like wow. What is wow is on the day he died, April 5th, 1923, the second he died, all the electricity in Cairo went out, unexplained reasons. Thousands of miles away, back in England, his dog Susie, at the very same minute, stood up, howled, and fell over dead. This is the kernel of Curse of the Mummy. And without this, we wouldn't have a whole host of things that permeate our society, like Abbott and Costello Meet the Mummy, the 1955 movie. The whole idea of mummies being scary creatures. Or those of you who are old enough to think back like I am to the 1970s, in this case, 1978 and Saturday Night Live, you can remember Steve Martin and his group, the Toot Uncommons, performing his song King Tut. This is all because of Lord Carnarvon. And to me, that's just an astonishing tracing of history going back. That's sort of another goosebump moment. So he dies relatively young. His wife, lives 46 years after his death. She dies in 1969 at the age of 93, pretty impoverished, sadly. So we're going to stop here and talk a little bit about why that is, because it involves misogyny, in this case, codified misogyny. So if you're familiar with Downton Abbey, you know that the eldest male inherits everything in the estate, and women have no rights of property. So she inherited an enormous amount of money from her father when he died, from Alfred de Rothschild. And from what I can tell, Almina never really understood money and how it worked. She'd always had lots of it. Her father spoiled her, gave her whatever she wanted. She spent money like water. She was incredibly generous, really a good person, I think. So I don't think the concept that the money would ever end occurred to her. And then, of course, after you inherit the money, you have to actually manage it to make sure it doesn't run out, which, of course, is sort of what it did for her. But what was worse for her is that all the objects, all the incredible art she inherited from her father in Halton House, when he died, it became the property of her husband, not hers. And then when her husband died, it became the property of her son, the next Earl of Carnarvon, with whom she did not get along. And I can only imagine that she felt, understandably, that these objects that she had grown up with, a priceless treasure, should be hers. They were hers, but now they weren't. They were her son's, and she needed money. So what we know is, I knew when I started this lecture that she had sold over 1,000 objects, Egyptian antiquities, to the Met, the Metropolitan Museum of Art, in 1926. And she did this basically illegally. These were not her things to sell. These were her son's. So what's interesting is how that story grew. The very first time I gave this lecture was in Cincinnati at a wonderful museum that I cannot recommend more highly, called the Taft Museum of Art. And you'll see, when you see the photograph of it, that it is clearly a family house. And in fact, it was President Taft's family's house. And after I was done with the lecture, one of the curators came up to me and said, do you know we have something that Almina sold to the Tafts? And I said, you're kidding. She said, oh, a very important something too. This is a Renaissance salt cellar. This is made in France around 1555. It's incredibly important. And it was Almina's father's. And she sold it in the 1930s. So it's like, well, that's very interesting. Thank you very much. So I go to Washington, D.C. to give the lecture. And we come to the home of Marjorie Merriweather Post, you see here dressed as Marie Antoinette. For those of you who don't remember Mrs. Post, her father founded Postum, which was sort of a coffee substitute and morning cereals, and she developed this as a businesswoman, into what became General Foods, and made a fortune, and lived a wonderful life, a lavish life. And her house in Washington, D.C., which is called Hillwood, is a museum today. I think one of the finest museums of decorative arts in America, and certainly a much underappreciated museum. So when I gave this lecture here, after the lecture was over, one of the guides came up to me and said, you know, we have something that Almina sold to Mrs. Post, and it's what you see in this next slide, which are the only known solid gold heart-shaped boxes from France in the 18th century, meaning the only known shaped like a heart with this kind of design. And that was pretty amazing. Mrs. Post had exquisite taste. And Almina, and I should say, from what I can tell, none of these objects were sold directly to any of the people from Almina. She sold them to dealers who then passed them on to these esteemed collectors. So you can guess where I'm going with this next slide, because I'm in Baltimore next at the Walters Art Museum, another museum that I think is hugely underappreciated in America, that has an incredible collection and something that everybody needs to see. So I give the lecture there. After that lecture, the director of the museum comes up to me and says, you know, we have these two pieces of Sèvres that were owned by Madame de Pompadour that were sold to Mr. Walters through Almina. This is some of the rarest Sèvres in the world. These are called elephant vases. They're very strange. Sèvres didn't make many of them, but they're very cool. And it's like, wow, Almina was really busy selling. Now, I think in addition to the fact that she felt as though these things were hers by right, from what I can tell, her son was not giving her any money And so she sort of was forced to do this to survive, because like I say, she died almost in poverty. And I think this is the only thing that kept her alive. Now, her successor as the Countess, the current Countess, has been very good at bringing Highclere to the attention of the world. She's written 3 books you see here. The first one, which I bought when I went there in 2007, tells the story of the Earl of Carnarvon, the 5th Earl, and Howard Carter, and the discovery of Tut's tomb. This, of course, was before Downton Abbey came on the scene. And then you have her 2 books about the real ladies of Downton Abbey. In 2011, Lady Almina and the real Downton Abbey, and then in 2013, Lady Catherine the Earl and the real Downton Abbey. Lady Catherine was the Countess who came after Almina. Very interesting stories. So I talked before about these houses making a living, having to support themselves. And if you don't have a lot of money or you don't have a lot of land, you have to figure out other ways to do that. And there are 2 big ways to do that. Filming, which we know Highclere Castle has done a lot of, and weddings. Weddings are very profitable, and you can see here a happy couple getting married in front of Highclere. In the next slide, you'll see how the Great Hall can be set up for your wedding. This isn't cheap. It's cost tens of thousands just to rent the space. I had some acquaintances from Tennessee who flew their entire graduating class on their 50th anniversary of high school over to Downton Abbey. They paid for them to fly over. They put them up in the Ritz. They put dinner in there, and then as they left at the end of the evening, you had these fireworks coming out from the ground. And this is what a great country house can do as far as giving you a real sense of like, wow. I mean, because really that's what this is. This is wow. Just going to stay and stop here for a minute. For those of you who remember my first lecture where I said my cat was driving me crazy by knocking things over. He doesn't like it when I talk on the phone too long. He's just started coming in with his new thing. He comes in with a ball, which he drops at my feet and expects me to throw to him. Yes, this is a cat, not a dog, but you can tell he's really getting pissed off. He's not getting all of my attention right now. So this photograph I took with wonderful light is to highlight how often this house was used long before Downton Abbey came along. It appeared as the fictional Totley Towers, the seat of Sir Watkin Bassett, in 5 episodes of a very popular 1990s TV series, which I'm sure most of you are familiar with, called Jeeves and Wooster, with Hugh Laurie and Stephen Fry, who've gone on to, of course, be very famous in other roles. And this is important because if you look back, particularly in the 70s and 80s, at these old PBS or BBC series, you'll see Highclere popping up again and again and again. It's just really hit the jackpot with Downton Abbey, and nobody, including Gillian Fellows, nobody expected Downton Abbey to be the hit that it was. So how did Downton Abbey come to be in our consciousness? Well, it started here, because if those of you remember back, way back to the early 2000s, this is Maggie Smith as the fictional Lady Trentham. Now, this was a movie that got everything started because she appeared as this fictional character in Gosford Park in 2001. And you can see Gillian Fellows, who wrote the screenplay, with his Oscar for Best Screenplay in 2002 at the Oscar Awards. And it was from this that the idea for Downton Abbey came about, of making a series about life at a country house, not just a one-off. And I was very lucky to hear Gillian Fellows being interviewed here in Boston a few years ago. And so you could ask questions from the audience, and someone said to him, "Gosh, you're so lucky to get Maggie Smith to play the role of the Dowager Countess." And he said, luck had nothing to do with it. I wrote that role for her because what I had experienced with her in Gosford Park. And I, of course, think that she is the most important character in the whole series, certainly the one that I love the most. And Vanity Fair, I think, says everything about her in this role. She plays the Dowager Countess of Grantham as close to the cliff edge of caricature as no other living actress could. Interestingly enough, she says in the interview program she's never once seen a minute of the TV series, and she doesn't want to. And I think a lot of actresses and actors that I see don't want to see their own work on film. But my God, she is an international treasure, just simply fantastic. So you might remember in the 3rd season of Downton Abbey, they brought up her American counterpart, played by Shirley MacLaine here. the fight off the two dowagers, as it were. Now, if you look past her questionable facelift, I can say to me that Shirley MacLaine was just a big dud. She did not live up to the hype. She was just, she was all right in the role. She couldn't hold a candle to Maggie Smith. But let's talk about the similarities of reality versus fiction here again. So her character was Martha Levinson. She was the widow of a dry goods millionaire from Cincinnati, who of course was Jewish, which means that Cora, Lady Grantham, was Jewish. Almina was Jewish. So that's the beginning of the similarities, but there's a lot of female power going on in here, and you'll see in the next slide how much that has really come to focus and create what Downton Abbey is. So all three of the actresses who played the sisters came from families of only sisters. Elizabeth McGovern, who played Cora, has two children, two daughters, and the Countess of Carnarfon is from a family of 6 sisters. I think that's wicked cool, purely by accident, but still an amazing coincidence. And I think part of this, to me, is a testament to Julian Fellowes, who I think writes very sympathetically characters who are oftentimes not historically part of the power structure. So women, gay men, servants, he gives them life in ways that most writers never have. So in the continuation of the similarities, if you can think back to Mrs. Patmore, the cook, when she was losing her eyesight and she mistakenly put salt instead of sugar on a dessert, and Lord and Lady Grantham sent her to have a cataract operation, which restored her sight. Well, in 2012, Lady Carnarfon and her chef, who you see her with here, Paul Brooke Taylor, had an interesting sort of parallel to that. He was playing football, which of course I mean soccer in American terminology, and got hit in the head with a ball, pushed his head back, and his eyesight got blurry. And he went to the doctor, and the doctor said, it's fine. It's just going to take time. Give it some time, and it will get better. 2 months later, his eyesight's no better. And Lady Carnarfon sends him to a neurologist who examines him thoroughly and says, you've had a stroke. And what's interesting about this is that there's actually a term that medical professionals use for this kind of stroke. It's called a beauty parlor stroke syndrome. And the reason it's called that is that when you're having your head washed at a beauty parlor and they stretch your neck back over the sink, it stretches the arteries in the same way that the ball pushed his head back, sometimes too much in the neck, and causes blood clots, which can then lead to a stroke. So I should say that right now, everybody should be very happy that they're washing their own hair at home. Not that I don't love beauty salons. Sadly, even though Paul Brooke Taylor's eyesight got better, and he's still today the chef here, it's never completely recovered. And for those of you familiar with strokes in general and their symptoms, this is pretty much the par for the course, because sometimes you get better, sometimes you don't. He says it's like seeing everything through a gauze now. And he was only 36 when this happened, and that's what he said in the interviews. He said, I'm 36, how could I have had a stroke? Once again, life imitating reality, because, or I should say fiction imitating life, because this was filmed with Mrs. Patmore before he had this accident. He said he was watching Downton Abbey and was shocked to see sort of the same kind of thing happen with Mrs. Patmore. Just to prove to you that people who live in big houses are human too and have all the foibles of humanity, late last year, Lady Carnarfon asked her stepson and stepdaughter to move out. There has reportedly been bad blood between her and her stepchildren for some time. And Lord Porchester, her stepson, you see here on the right, who will inherit the earldom when his father dies, and of course is his son from his first marriage, has had some tough words for this. And it's a shame to see something like this happen. But as I say, it's humanity. And speaking of trouble, as far as I'm concerned, everything bad that happens in Downton Abbey started here. When you see Lady Mary for the first time looking over and she sees that Mr. Pamuk is not a fat, greasy man as she was told he was going to be, but this hot hunk. And of course, as you'll remember, he comes to her bedroom and has sex with her, and in the middle of the act, he dies. And she has to find friends, neighbors, countrymen to carry his body back to his bedroom so he can be discovered as if he died in his own bed. And of course, she's seen by Daisy the maid, and then all kinds of trouble sort of spins out from there. But what's interesting is that when he was here in Boston, Julian Fellowes said that this was based on a real incident, that a friend of his who owned one of the great houses of England was going through the archives and came across the diary of a great aunt from the 1890s, where she talked about the fact that this is exactly what had happened. A young, probably 20-something debutante had brought a diplomat back, hot and young, and he died in the middle of it, and she didn't know what to do. And of course, this was in a time when, in Victorian times, of course, these great houses for visitors were segregated by sex. So you had the men's wing and the women's wing. And the women's wing were basically two things. You had old widows, or you had young women who were not married yet. And the old widow, who was the great aunt, who was the center of this, realized right away that all of the women, whether they were aware of this or not, would be scandalized and their reputations tarnished if this man was discovered in this debutante's bed. So she organized a whole retinue of women to carry him back to his bed, and nothing further ever happened from that. Nothing bad was ever discovered. And Julian Fellowes says, he sort of stroked his chin, he said, that's going to come in handy someday, that story. And by golly, it has. So it's important to remember how popular the West Wing is in Britain, which I've always found interesting. The West Wing and Frasier and Friends, three programs that the Brits love. And what Julian Fellowes says about Downton Abbey, it looks like classic period drama, but the structure is more like the West Wing. I think that's true. That's why you can't stop watching it. It is a high-class soap opera, the best high-class soap opera ever produced. And what you see here in this photograph are the actors' trailers, because when they were filming here, of course, the house was closed for months at a time to allow filming to take place. And something that I think is shocking, we don't realize this unless we're involved with film production, a scene that would be maybe 5 minutes of having dinner could take 2 days to shoot. Getting the lighting right, getting the actors right, getting costumes right. Just, I think it's a different world to do a film and have the patience to do that. So by the second season, Downton Abbey has become so popular, there's a fear that there won't be further seasons. And you see something like this coming up. Keep calm, there will be a third series. Series, of course, being what the Brits call a season. And of course, the third season was supposed to be the last, because Julian Fellowes had said in interviews he'd planned this from the beginning to be 3 seasons, and it would end after the Great War ended in 1918, right up to the 1920s. But of course, it was so successful that it went on and on and on, and you know, the marketing went on and on and on too. And I think that's brilliant, particularly the books that were brought out. So in 2011, you have The World of Downton Abbey. In 2012, you have The Chronicles of Downton Abbey. Then in 2013, you have Behind the Scenes at Downton Abbey. And then in 2014, A Year in the Life of Downton Abbey. I have all of these books. They've all been really helpful for research into not just the houses that were used, and I say houses plural, but also the actors and how things worked. When I say plural, I'm thinking specifically this house on the right here, which you see functioning as the Grantham's London townhouse. This is actually a house in Berkshire, a very beautiful country house called Basildon Park. And this is something that was used a lot and is used by all filmmakers. One house, same interiors, but to film those interiors, you use 3 different houses because you like this room from that one, this room from that one. And it gives us a sort of an inherent whole, but the details of how they're made, I find to be really interesting and intriguing. And then, of course, we can talk about the merchandising. Marks and Spencer, the great famous British department store, brought out their own line of Downton Abbey soaps and candles. There are a lot of soaps with Downton Abbey attached to them. My favorite one, if you remember the evil O'Brien, Lady Grantham's maid, who pushed the soap out of the tub so she slipped and fell and lost her child that she was carrying. So this is O'Brien's soap called Prickly Pear and Crab Apple because she was prickly and she was a crab. And of course, if you have soap, you have to have tea. I mean, how can you possibly be British and not have Downton Abbey tea? And of course, after your tea, because I love this is called Grantham Breakfast Blend, not just any tea, Grantham Breakfast Blend. After your tea, you have to have some alcohol. So you have Downton Abbey wine. Now, all of these, sadly, are no longer available. They were made while the series was running, but they certainly contributed to the success and to the feeling of the series. What is still available, and actually is quite new, is something that's not associated with Downton Abbey per se, but with the filming location, and that's Highclere Castle Gin, which just came out last year. So this is wonderful in the sense that you can see the lavender there on the left in the photograph. This is not just any gin. This is gin that is flavored with herbs grown on the Highclere estate. And as it turns out, the oldest gin distillery in England is just down the road from Highclere Castle, which is where this is made. And I was very lucky. They had a tour to introduce this in American cities, and my boss, the CEO, Brinton Simons, and I were invited to the British Consul General's residence in Boston, where Lady Carnarfon came and complete with butlers who served gin, incredible gin. I had a drink called a White Lady that made me very happy for the rest of the day. And it's something that I think you can now get in liquor stores. I highly recommend it. My favorite of all the merchandising that came out about Downton Abbey is a series of paper dolls, and of every character. This is my absolute favorite because I love the Dowager Countess. So you can see, you cut this out, you have different dresses, but with her, you have an assortment of emotions. You have 6 of them. But if you look at them, they're all exactly the same: judgmental, skeptical, pleased, sneering, smug, except for eye rolling, which is actually different than the other 5. God, I love Maggie Smith. Now, let's talk about homemade stuff that comes out of Downton Abbey. It's astonishing how much it swept America, and that was something that was, at least to my British friends, was always sort of a mystery to them. They couldn't understand why Americans were so obsessed with Downton Abbey. This is a man in 2014 who made a Halloween costume. He made this, he drew this. This is the house, that's his head where the arrow is, and he walked with his kids door to door, trick-or-treating. Now that's real dedication, and in my experience, it's also real dedication from a man, because I've given a lot of lectures in Downton Abbey, and I can tell you most of the people are women who are into Downton Abbey, so this man gets a special gold star. Now, at NEHGS, where I work, we have a contest every year around Easter time for Peeps, where anybody can enter a contest to design something involving Easter Peeps. And in 2012, the winner was Peepton Abbey, which you see here, called Great Moments from Masterpeeps Theater. And it won, as I said, the first prize. And not surprisingly, it was made by Ginevra Morse, who's the woman who's running the seminar right now and who introduced us today. And I just love the fact that you see how she has them right there in the same font as they had in the TV show Peepton Abbey. And what they're doing, should you wonder, this, you see that the peep in the middle with the little X's over his eyes, he's dead. So that's Mr. Pamuk, as it turns out, and he's being carried back to his bedroom where his body can be discovered innocently, of course. Ah, I just love that. So if you go on YouTube, you can't believe the things that are on there about Downton Abbey. This is Doll's House Downton. Which, not surprisingly, is sort of a stop action of dolls playing the parts. So this is the staff lining up in front of the great house, and in the next slide, you see Lord and Lady Grantham and Lady Mary having tea, and this is when they're told through their newspapers that the Titanic has sunk, the horror of it all. And in the next slide, you actually see the sinking of the Titanic brought very vividly to life. So my favorite in this genre is a professionally produced one called Downton Arby's, which not surprisingly takes place at an Arby's fast food franchise. And you can see in this next slide, Lord and Lady Arby's being told that they will forfeit their Arby's franchise if they cannot find a male heir. This is the shock on their faces. In the next slide, you'll see the official notification from corporate written to Lord Arby's that if, in fact, he has not come up with a man, it's not going to happen. But my favorite in all of these is the reaction of his 3 daughters when they're told that because they're girls, they can't inherit. And of those 3, my favorite is the actress who plays Lady Edith. Perfect expression on her face when she So you remember Bates and Anna, probably the most popular couple. Bates says in this little video that he goes to Lord Arby's and asks for permission to marry Anna. And Lord Arby says, not only will I give you my permission, I will give you as a wedding present an Arby's Airport Express. But to give you the 2 accoutrements of these 2 characters, you see Bates walking in with a cane, where that red arrow is there on the left. And Anna, even though she's working in a fast food place in the early 21st century, has on her head a 19th century maid's cap. So to show you how much this permeated every level of American society, we actually have a Sesame Street version, Upside Downton Abbey. And we have the Dowager Countess and Lord Grantham prepared as Muppets. I mean, what could be better than that? I can tell you what's better than that. The only way you can top that is cats, because everything can be brought back to cats. And in this case, a book, which I'm embarrassed to say that I own, called Downton Abbey, where famous scenes throughout the TV series are acted out. And my favorite one is, once again, the evil O'Brien, in this case, not putting soap, but putting mouse traps underneath Lady Grantham bathing. And I love her bathing. I particularly love her towel, which says herself on it with a little paw print. So on the theme of Lady Mary and cats, there was original art that was produced during the sale, during the run of the TV series, and this is Downton Abbey, which you could buy a limited edition signed print of. And this was just one of many kinds of art you could buy associated with it. And while we're on the subject of Lady Mary, it's important to tell you that so many of the interiors were not actually filmed at Highclere Castle, including Lady Mary's bedroom. They were done on a soundstage in London, and this is what you see here. This is Lady Mary's bedroom. And to give you a bigger view of what this looks like, we're going to pull back, and in the next slide, you can actually see the soundstage with the lights, and those lights are going over those false walls to light beyond. Nowhere near as exotic as filming at Highclere Castle. So in 2012, the cast was brought over here to do a tour of America, and 5 of them were coming on, I believe, I'm not sure, one of the morning shows in New York, and they sent a limo to pick them up, and they said, no, we want to take the subway. We want to take the New York City subway. And this is them. And you can see Lord Grantham with his hand in front of the W in downtown, creating a Downton. And what I love in this photograph is the closeness of this cast, because in all the things I've read and all the things I've watched about this cast, they were unusually close, because humans, after all, are humans, and everybody doesn't get along with everybody else. And you hear all kinds of stories about casts of movies or TV shows where the actors hate each other. These people really loved each other. And in all the interviews that I've watched, the one cast member that everybody loved above everybody else, believe it or not, was Thomas the Evil Footman, who you see there on the left, who, it's just, what a wonderful feeling that photograph gives you. It's just, it does my heart good to see that. So I'm going to end with words from the Dowager. Don't be defeatist. It's very middle class, and God knows we can't be defeatist now. I have above that there the Downton Abbey exhibition, which toured the United States last year, was a huge success. A lot of costumes, bringing back, I think, in conjunction with the movie, which was released. We're all, I think, very lucky to be part of this amazing piece of history, fictional and real.
All right. Well, thank you, Curt, for that very entertaining and fun presentation, and certainly educational. But before we get to your questions, I do want to invite you to participate in future events within this special webinar series, as well as other forthcoming and upcoming online programs. You can register for this free series and see a list of all of our upcoming online programs at americanancestors.org/education/online-classes. Curt's next webinar is on Friday, June 5th, when he'll be speaking about the English Garden, Perfection on Earth. All right, so with that, let's turn to some of your questions. Go ahead and type your question into the questions panel, and we'll try to get through as many as we can. So, Curt, of course, the name of this beautiful house is Highclere Castle. Brian asks, is the term castle a descriptive term, or is it just kind of self-imposed instead of manor or house?
It's a good question, and the answer is it's self-imposed. So there actually were houses that started off as castles. Castles, of course, being defensive, didn't have windows in the ground floors because you didn't want people breaking in and killing you in your sleep. Houses developed a lot after castles, after it became safer. But what happened was it became very, very stylish to have a house that had originally been a castle. So if you didn't, you could change your name of your house to Castle. So as you saw in one of the early slides, it was originally called Highclere House. It was changed to Highclere Castle because it was more romantic. And by the 19th century, when Highclere Castle was reborn, you had this great love of the Victorians of the idea of romance in the age of chivalry and castles. And of course, that was all just bull because life was horrible then. But yes, the word castle was just an appendage they tacked on. The same thing with abbey. Downton Abbey is a perfect example too. There were a number of houses that started off originally as abbeys that were turned into private houses through the dissolution of the monasteries by Henry VIII when they left the Catholic Church. But the same thing happened. Abbey became a very popular title for a house, and if you didn't have it, you could take your house and just rename it something Abbey, and it gave it an association of being more old and going back further into the mists of time.
Thank you. Now, a few people have pointed out or are kind of questioning. You mentioned that I think Lady Corazon was the highest ranking American in kind of the British framework. A lot of folks are pointing out that Meghan Markle, they're asking if Meghan Markle would be considered.
Boy, I didn't think about Meghan. That's a good question. I don't know. I guess I'd have to say Meghan probably is higher, but then I'm not sure if that's true because they're sort of removing themselves from the royal family. That's a really good question. I'd have to say she probably is higher. That's very interesting. I would have to correct myself on that, but I don't know because there's a lot of confusion swirling around what it's going to mean when Harry and Meghan leave official duties. Is whether they're part of the official royal family anymore, but she will still have her title. So I would guess, yes, she would be the highest ranking American. She wins the prize.
Well, thank you everyone for pointing that out. And Diana asks, do you know how many bedrooms are in Highclere Castle? She also asks if there is a vineyard on the premises.
I don't know of a vineyard. I mean, there could be. Believe it or not, grape growing and winemaking has become much more popular in the UK, and that's mainly a result of global warming because you really couldn't grow grapes very well there for the past 500 years. I don't think there is one. I think if there was one, it would probably be Highclere Castle wine. I'm sorry, what was the first question?
Oh, how many bedrooms?
It's interesting. I've seen Lady Carnarfon interviewed about this question. She says between 50 and 60. And someone said to her, you don't know? And she said, well, I've had the kids up and we go together, we each count a floor, but we always get lost. So we don't really know exactly how many because we could never put it all together before. There's the answer, between 50 and 60 bedrooms.
And a few people are asking about where Highclere, the name Highclere, comes from.
That's a good question, and I have no idea where it comes from. You know, it's funny. There is actually the highest point on the estate, which is where the 5th Earl, the one who discovered Tut's tomb, is buried, is called Beacon Hill. And I would assume that the word high has something to do with a rise in the land, but I really don't know. It's a very good question.
And Shannon asks, how many of these old manors or houses are still privately owned versus maybe being owned or part of the National Trust?
The vast, vast majority of them are privately owned and not open to the public. So the government, the UK government estimates there are between 6,000 and 10,000 of these houses today. And Of that, maybe 900 are open to the public. The National Trust owns just over 400. There are private houses, Blenheim Palace and Highclere, of course, are both private, that are open to the public. But a very small minority, believe it or not, is open to the public.
And Rebecca, who is the curator of decorative arts at Hillwood, which we mentioned.
Hi, Rebecca. I know Rebecca. Yes, ma'am. Rebecca, yes.
She's asking, can we assume that all of the Alfred de Rothschild objects that found their way into American collections during this period, did they come from Almina?
I would say yes. I don't know that to be the case. I would say it's almost absolutely true it's from her, because we know she was desperate for money. And they all were sold, the ones that we're aware of were all sold in the 20s and 30s. And her husband died in 1922, and that's when she started really needing money. So it seems very likely she used a number of London dealers and even some New York dealers to sell things. So I would guess that it's pretty much her, because those items were in theory entailed, meaning they couldn't be sold. They had to stay with the title and with the house, and became the property of the next earl. So I would say it's pretty much all her. And of course, the other part of that is we don't know just what she sold. We only know what I discovered, not me, but museum after museum says, oh, we have this and we have that. And I don't know if anybody has put together all the various pieces of Almina stuff and said, look at this great mass of art that left England. And of course, part of that is knowing who the dealer that the museum bought it from got it from. So it may not always know that it came from Almina. So I also would assume that there are quite a few pieces in private collections around the world that are not known, except to their owners, that they came from Almina.
And kind of continuing along the story of Almina, Susan asked, where did she eventually end up living? And how could you learn more about kind of her story?
There are, gosh, what's that guy's name? There are a few books written about her, more than a few actually. Well, you saw the first one, Lady Almina and the Real Downton Abbey, that I showed you in the screen, written by the current Countess of Carnarfon. There's also a man in Wales, I can't think of his name, who's written a series of books about her and the family. And she died in Bristol, I believe, in what we would call a townhouse, what they would call a semi-detached. And I believe, very sadly, that she died choking on a chicken bone, something like that.
Now, maybe one final question, and several people are asking about, is there going to be a sequel? Is there going to be another series to Downton Abbey? Any insider knowledge that you might have, or any premonitions that you might want to provide?
I think it's pretty safe to say the answer to that is no. The Downton Abbey movie was all right as far as its success. It wasn't a huge success, and I have to say personally, I thought the Downton Abbey movie was sort of a dud. It was fine, but it wasn't something that was engaging the way the TV series was. And the reason I'd say that it's definitely not is that there are two TV series out there now that Julian Fellowes has done. One of them, I'm sure a lot of you have seen, is called Belgravia, and the other is called The English Game. I think that one only has 4 episodes in it. And The English Game is about the invention of football, meaning soccer again. And it's really well done. And he's moving on to other things. He's supposedly working on a TV series about New York in the Gilded Age. So I think it's safe to say that Downton Abbey is done.
And maybe just one final question. So Betsy asks, once the world kind of gets back to quote unquote normal, will you return to leading tours to English country houses in the future?
You cannot keep me away from English country house. When I was describing to you guys about early in the lecture about the Temple of Diana at Highclere and the magic that you feel walking around there, which I feel at almost every one of these houses. It's talking about these houses even here from my apartment in Boston gives me a sense of hope to see them again, because I can't imagine life without them for me. And they are a huge part of the tourist element of the British economy, and they're all suffering like everybody because they're all closed. So I think as soon as they can, they'll be coming back. Some of them are actually already opening, I believe, at the first part of next week. So yes, we have a tour planned, believe it or not, for Christmas at an English country house in Shropshire called Weston Park. And it's the first week of December, so just actually before Christmas, and it's called an English Country Christmas. And I'm keeping my fingers and toes crossed that that will happen, because that's my favorite place in all of Britain to take a tour, because unlike a country house that's been turned into a hotel, and I didn't even talk about that, lots of country houses have other purposes now. Hotels, colleges, turned into apartments and flats. Weston Park, where we stay for this Christmas tour, is still all of one piece. It's not a hotel. It's owned by a nonprofit foundation, and you have what they call exclusive use. There are, I believe, 38 bedrooms, and if you book 12 of them, you get the whole house, and no one else is there but your group. And you have 2 live-in butlers and a French chef, and it's pretty much close to heaven.
Wow. Well, I think we're all crossing our fingers and toes that that comes to fruition, and certainly time will tell if there is another season or another movie for Downton Abbey. We can hope. So unfortunately, that is all the time we have for today. If you have other questions, please feel free to contact us at heritagetours@nehgs.org. And I would also like to thank you again for joining us today. As you leave the event, you'll have the opportunity to fill out a survey and give us your feedback. As we continue to expand our webinars and online offerings, any and all feedback is extremely helpful and appreciated. And I also want to note that this free webinar was made possible by the generous support of members and friends around the world. Please consider making a gift to American Ancestors to keep these programs free and to create more free programs for you and for audiences around the world. If you'd like to learn more about American Ancestors and the fabulous heritage tours, many of which are led by Curt, please visit americanancestors.org/heritage-tours. Please stay safe, stay healthy, and I hope to see you at our online programs in the future. Goodbye for now.